Hello, everyone. Donald Trump invited Canada to the negotiating table for what he called the biggest deal between the two countries in history. Mark Carney's response was six words that redefine the relationship between the United States and Canada. We are not negotiating with you. Canada didn't just refuse to talk, it fired back. Within 24 hours, Ottawa announced retaliatory tariffs on $47 billion in American exports, energy export restrictions that would hit border states that winter, critical mineral controls cutting off American access to rare earth elements, and a formal diplomatic downgrade, recalling Canada's ambassador to Washington for the first time in the 158-year history of the bilateral relationship. Warren Buffett said, "What Carney demonstrated is the most powerful move in business or politics, the willingness to never walk in." He explained why "I don't need you" is the most terrifying sentence a dealmaker can ever hear. But here's what nobody expected. Trump's reaction wasn't rage. It wasn't the volcanic, all-caps social media eruption the world had come to expect. It was something different, something quieter, and according to people in the room, far more unsettling. It was panic, real, visible, strategic panic, because his entire playbook, the threats, the tariffs, the pressure, the art of the deal itself depends on the other side wanting a deal. And Carney just told him Canada doesn't want one. So let's start with what Trump actually offered, because you need to understand the setup before you can appreciate how devastating the rejection was. Trump's announcement came from the Rose Garden with optimistic framing and conciliatory language. "We're willing to work with our great Canadian friends." He proposed what he called a comprehensive grand bargain, a sweeping negotiation covering tariffs, energy, Arctic cooperation, border security, and trade. The scope was enormous. The tone was magnanimous. The media initially treated it as a positive development, with headlines reading "Trump extends olive branch to Canada," and commentators praising the willingness to negotiate. Here was the dealmaker doing what dealmakers do. But behind the scenes, the offer was calculated, and not in a way that benefited both sides. Trump's advisors knew that Canada had been diversifying its trade away from the United States at an alarming speed. Every month that passed without a deal, Canada was signing new agreements with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and a growing list of Indo-Pacific partners. Every one of those agreements made American leverage weaker. The negotiation invitation wasn't designed to produce a fair deal. It was designed to pause Canada's diversification. If Canada sat down at the table, it would have an incentive to slow walk its alternative trade agreements while waiting for American terms. The process itself would buy the United States time to rebuild leverage that was evaporating by the week. And then there were the preconditions, the fine print that most media coverage skipped entirely, but that Carney's team read with the precision you'd expect from a former central banker. To sit down at the table, Canada would have to pause all retaliatory tariffs while American tariffs remained in full effect, suspend its ongoing trade negotiations with the EU, the UK, Japan, South Korea, and Australia for the duration, accept national security as a legitimate legal basis for tariffs between NATO allies, which would retroactively validate every tariff Trump had imposed, and agree to an American-set timeline and agenda. Think about what that means. Canada would enter the room with its hands tied, its alternatives frozen, its legal position conceded, and its agenda set by the other side. American tariffs would continue damaging Canadian exports throughout. Canadian diversification would stop, and Trump would control the clock. The preconditions weren't negotiation terms. They were surrender terms disguised as process. Trump wasn't offering to negotiate. He was offering Canada the privilege of being dominated in a process controlled by the people who created the crisis in the first place. Carney read the preconditions. His team analyzed every strategic implication, and within 48 hours, he held a press conference that lasted 4 minutes and changed the trajectory of North American relations. The setting was deliberate. Not Parliament, not a trade conference, but the Lester B. Pearson Building, Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs headquarters. The location itself was a signal. This was a foreign policy statement, not a trade response. His tone was measured, almost regretful, not angry, not defiant, but carrying the quiet certainty of someone who has made a decision and will not revisit it. He opened with a single sentence. The United States has proposed comprehensive bilateral negotiations. I am here to explain why Canada will not be participating. Then he gave 3 reasons, each more devastating than the last. Reason 1, trust. You cannot negotiate in good faith with a government that treats agreements as disposable. We signed USMCA, a negotiated, ratified, legally binding treaty between 3 sovereign nations. It was signed by this president. It was ratified by this Congress. It was celebrated by this administration as a triumph of American deal-making. And the same administration violated its terms through unilateral tariff actions, taken without consultation, without warning, and without legal basis. We negotiated that agreement in good faith. We honored every provision. The United States did not. It treated the agreement as optional the moment it became inconvenient. The pattern is now established. Any agreement reached with this administration will be honored only until it becomes politically convenient to break it. We will not participate in that performance. Reason 2, sovereignty. The preconditions require Canada to pause our retaliatory measures while American tariffs remain in place. They require us to suspend our trade negotiations with the EU, the UK, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. They require us to accept that national security is a valid basis for tariffs against a NATO ally. And they require us to accept an American-set agenda and timeline. These are not the terms of a negotiation between sovereign equals. These are the terms of a surrender, and Canada does not surrender. Reason 3, independence. Canada's path forward does not require American agreement. In the past 12 months, Canada has signed or advanced trade agreements with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and ASEAN nations. Our trade diversification is not a threat. It is not a bargaining chip. It is a permanent structural shift in Canada's economic architecture. We will not pause that shift to enter a negotiation process designed to slow our progress while American leverage is rebuilt. We have alternatives. We are pursuing them. And we will not stop to have a conversation with a government that has demonstrated it cannot be trusted to keep its word. Then came the final line. Carney paused. The room was already silent. We wish the United States well. We are not negotiating with it. He turned, walked off the podium, and took no questions. 4 minutes, 3 reasons, 6 words. Done. There were 3 full seconds of silence in the press room before it erupted. International media scrambled. Diplomatic analysts immediately noted something most viewers might have missed. A refusal to negotiate is more hostile than a counteroffer, more hostile than a walkout, more hostile even than retaliatory tariffs. Because all of those responses acknowledge the other side's relevance. They say, we disagree with you. A refusal to negotiate says something far worse. You are not worth our time. It denies the other side's relevance entirely. And for a president who built his entire identity around being the man who makes deals, being told you're not worth negotiating with is the deepest possible wound. The first sign that this was different from every previous confrontation, Trump didn't immediately respond. For over 3 hours after Carney's statement, there was nothing. No Truth Social posts, no angry phone calls, no statements. Aides later described the mood in the White House as confused. They had prepared responses for every scenario they could imagine. Counteroffers, public rejections, walkouts, full retaliation. They had not wargamed the possibility that Canada would simply refuse to engage at all. When your opponent doesn't show up to the fight, your fight plan is worthless. Then the strategic reality set in. Trump's entire negotiation philosophy collapses without a counterpart. Tariffs work as leverage only if the other side is trying to get them removed. If Canada has stopped caring about American tariffs, then the tariffs stop being leverage and start being self-inflicted wounds. Threats of escalation have no target. Escalating against someone who isn't engaged is like shouting into an empty room. The art of the deal requires a deal. And you can't make a deal with someone who won't take your calls. The phone started ringing off the hook at the White House. American CEOs demanding to know when trade would normalize. Auto manufacturers missing Canadian-made parts. Energy companies needing Canadian crude oil. The housing industry desperate for Canadian lumber. Agricultural exporters watching the Canadian market close. And for every one of those calls, the answer was the same devastating reality. There is no process for normalizing trade. Canada won't talk. There is no timeline, no framework, no table. When Trump finally responded, It was revealing in its disorientation. His Truth Social posts cycled through contradictory messages without landing on any coherent position. First came bravado. Canada will come crawling back. They need us more than we need them. Then grievance. Carney is making a huge mistake. Very disrespectful. Then vague threats. We have many options. Canada doesn't know what's coming. Then confusion. Why won't Canada negotiate? We offered them a great deal. Bravado, grievance, threats, confusion, cycling without landing. That's not the messaging of someone in control. That's the messaging of someone flailing. And notably absent from every single post. Any specific policy response, any concrete countermove, any plan. The most revealing details came from inside the White House itself. Senior advisors privately told reporters they didn't see it coming. One advisor was quoted anonymously, "We war-gamed every scenario. Counteroffers, public rejections, walkouts, full retaliation. We did not war-game, they won't talk to us at all." That scenario wasn't on the board. Another advisor was even more blunt. "We built the entire strategy around getting them to the table. The tariffs, the pressure, the olive branch, all of it was designed to create enough pain that they'd negotiate. If they've decided the pain is preferable to negotiating with us, we don't have a strategy anymore." The National Economic Council was convened in an emergency session. The realization was sinking in across every department. Canada's refusal to negotiate meant that American tariffs on Canadian goods had no off-ramp, no process to modify them, no framework to phase them out, no diplomatic channel through which to even begin discussing terms. The tariffs would just sit there, hurting American consumers, damaging American industries, driving up prices on everything from gasoline to lumber, and accomplishing nothing because the nation they were designed to pressure had decided it simply didn't care. They built a machine designed to drag Canada to the negotiating table. Carney just told them the table doesn't exist, and then Canada fired back. Within 24 hours of Carney's rejection, Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs held a press conference. Her opening statement drew a line that had never been drawn before. "The measures we are announcing today are not negotiating tactics. They are not designed to bring the United States to the table. They are permanent adjustments to Canada's economic and diplomatic architecture." That distinction, not leverage, but policy, is what makes the retaliation so devastating. If the retaliatory actions were leverage, they'd be temporary and reversible. But as policy, they're structural, permanent, and written into legislation, requiring parliamentary votes to reverse. There's nothing for the United States to solve through future negotiations, because the actions aren't designed to be undone. They're designed to be the new normal. First, retaliatory tariffs on American goods, agricultural products, manufactured goods, consumer electronics, specifically targeting Republican-heavy states, Iowa agriculture, Alabama manufacturing, Texas energy equipment, Wisconsin dairy. Total estimated impact: $47 billion in American exports now subject to Canadian counter tariffs, structured as permanent legislation, not executive orders. These aren't tariffs designed to end when negotiations resume, because negotiations aren't resuming. Second, energy export restrictions. Canada throttled oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric exports to the United States. Not a full cutoff, but a calibrated reduction designed to create sustained, escalating pain. Electricity exports to New York, New England, and the Pacific Northwest were reduced by 15 to 20%. Natural gas exports to the Midwest were cut. Oil shipments became subject to new sovereignty surcharges. The projected impact on American consumers: energy prices in border states rising 8 to 14%. Canada supplies 60% of America's crude oil imports, 98% of its electricity imports. A 15% reduction doesn't sound dramatic until you're a family in Vermont whose heating bill just doubled heading into winter. Third, critical mineral export controls. Canada restricted exports of rare earth elements, nickel, cobalt, lithium, and potash to non-allied nations, and the designation was deliberate. Under current diplomatic conditions, the United States does not qualify as an allied nation for purposes of Canadian strategic resource policy. Defense contractors, EV manufacturers, and tech companies now face supply chain disruptions for critical minerals they had assumed would always be available from their neighbor. Fourth, the diplomatic downgrade. Canada recalled its ambassador to Washington for consultations. In diplomatic language, recalling an ambassador is the step immediately below severing relations entirely. For 158 years, Canada and the United States maintained unbroken full diplomatic relations through 2 world wars, the Cold War, and every crisis the continent faced. That streak just ended, not with a dramatic rupture, but with a quiet, deliberate, unmistakable signal. We're done talking. Fifth, trade diversification acceleration. Canada fast-tracked every pending trade agreement with the EU, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and ASEAN. Agreements expected to take 18 to 24 months were being pushed to close within 6 to 9. Special economic zones were being established for non-US trade partners. Canada isn't just refusing to negotiate with the United States, it's replacing the United States, methodically, permanently, on an accelerated timeline. Warren Buffett then explained why what just happened is the most powerful move in negotiation and the most terrifying thing a dealmaker can experience. What Carney just did is something most people are psychologically incapable of doing. He walked away from a deal, not from a bad deal, from the very idea of a deal. That takes a kind of confidence that most people simply do not possess. The most powerful position in any negotiation is the genuine willingness to walk away. Not the bluff, but the genuine belief that you are better off with no deal than with any deal the other side is likely to offer. That belief is rare. It's terrifying for the other side. But Carney went further than walking away. Walking away implies you sat at the table and you left. Carney never walked in. He looked at the invitation, looked at the preconditions, looked at the pattern of broken agreements and said, "No, thank you. We have other plans." That is even more powerful. Walking away says, "This deal isn't good enough." Never walking in says, "I don't need you at all." And "I don't need you" is the most terrifying sentence in business because it means your leverage, all of it, is zero. When you've built your entire identity around being a dealmaker, the greatest dealmaker, the man who wrote The Art of the Deal, and someone refuses to make a deal with you, you don't just lose a negotiation. You lose the framework that makes you relevant. The art of the deal requires a deal. No deal, no art. And Carney just told the self-proclaimed greatest dealmaker in history that there will be no deal. I've been in business for 7 decades. I have never seen a negotiation end before it began. And I have never seen the party that refuses to negotiate be the party with more leverage. Usually the powerful side demands the negotiation and the weaker side tries to avoid it. Here, the supposedly weaker party, Canada, is the one refusing. That tells you everything about how far the power dynamic has shifted. On the retaliation, Buffett was precise. Carney framed every measure as permanent policy, not temporary leverage, and that matters enormously. If the tariffs were leverage, eventually you'd reverse them to make a deal. That gives the other side hope. But as policy, permanent, legislated, structural, there is no hope. The restrictions don't reverse when someone comes to the table because nobody is coming to the table. It eliminates the other side's options entirely. They're just stuck. The United States just learned something that every first-year business student knows. You cannot negotiate with someone who doesn't want to negotiate with you. All the leverage in the world means absolutely nothing if the other side has decided they'd rather build their own future than bargain for a seat at your table. Canada just chose its own future, and the United States wasn't invited. The fallout is cascading. Auto manufacturers are lobbying Congress as supply chains fracture. The big three depend on Canadian-made parts, and with no diplomatic process to restore normal trade flows, manufacturers are warning of production line shutdowns within weeks. One auto executive told CNBC, "We can't build cars without Canadian parts, and there's nobody to call to fix this." Energy companies are warning of winter heating cost spikes across every northern border state: New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Minnesota, Wisconsin. States that depend on Canadian energy are staring at double-digit price increases with no mechanism for relief. The housing industry is projecting lumber shortages that will add $20,000 to $30,000 to the cost of every new home built in America. Agricultural exporters are watching the Canadian market close with no timeline for reopening. And here's what's politically devastating. The anger is increasingly directed not at Ottawa, but at the White House. The industry's suffering don't blame Carney for refusing to negotiate. They blame the administration that created the conditions under which Canada decided negotiation was pointless. The man who was supposed to make the deals broke the relationship so badly that the other side decided deals were no longer worth pursuing. And American workers are paying the price. Congressional Republicans in border states are beginning to break ranks. Two senators from Michigan and one from New York have publicly called for the administration to take any steps necessary to restore diplomatic communication with Canada. Coded language for drop the preconditions and beg them to talk. But even that may not be enough anymore. The diversification is real. The alternative partnerships are real. The new economic architecture is being built in real time. And it doesn't include the United States. The international signal may be the most consequential development of all. Other nations are watching. The European Union, the United Kingdom, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, all noting that refusing to negotiate with the United States is now a viable strategic option. If Canada, America's closest ally, has decided that the United States cannot be trusted to negotiate in good faith, what does that say to nations with weaker ties? Canada didn't just reject negotiations. It created a precedent, a template, a proof of concept that saying no to America is not only possible, but potentially advantageous. And precedents in international relations are contagious. So here's where we stand. Trump proposed a grand bargain. Carney said no, not to the terms, but to the process itself. Canada will not negotiate with the United States. Then Canada fired back. Retaliatory tariffs, energy restrictions, mineral controls, a diplomatic downgrade, and accelerated trade diversification with every major economy except the one next door, all framed as permanent policy. Trump panicked, cycling through contradictory messages without landing on a coherent response. His own advisors admitted they hadn't wargamed this scenario, and Buffett called it the most powerful move in negotiation, the willingness to never walk in. The questions that now haunt Washington are stark. How long can the United States sustain tariffs on Canadian goods when Canada has stopped trying to get them removed? And every month those tariffs exist, they damage American consumers with no diplomatic process to resolve them. Will other nations follow Canada's precedent? And perhaps most pressingly, what do you do when the other side doesn't need you, has built the economic architecture to prove it, and has told the entire world that your word isn't worth the paper it's printed on? Trump built his presidency on the art of the deal. Carney just demonstrated something more powerful.